The Stoic Guide to Dealing with Uncertainty. The world is unpredictable, but you don't have to be. Every day we face change, delay, disruption, uncertainty, but there is a way to meet it, calmly, wisely, and with strength. Welcome to the Stoic Guide to Dealing with Uncertainty. This is not just a guide, it is a conversation with ancient wisdom, with Epictetus, with Seneca, with Marcus Aurelius, Zeno of Citium. Stoicism, ancient wisdom for modern life. I founded the Stoic school in Athens over 2,000 years ago, not in a palace, not in a temple, but on the steps of a painted porch. That is why they called us Stoics, from the Greek word stoa, a porch, a place open to all, a philosophy meant for everyone. What is Stoicism? At its heart, it is simple: to live in agreement with nature, to pursue virtue, courage, wisdom, justice, and self-control, and to accept that which we cannot change. In a world full of change, the Stoic stands still, not in resistance, but in harmony, because nature itself is change. The wise do not fear it, they move with it. You may know the names: Epictetus, once a slave, who taught freedom of the mind; Seneca, a powerful man who wrote of death and simplicity; Marcus Aurelius, an emperor and yet a student of humility. But Stoicism is not about names, it is about you, about the life you live, the peace you seek, and how you meet the unknown. Part 2. The Power of Acceptance. Let us begin where all uncertainty begins, with the nature of life itself. Change is not the exception. It is the rule. Everything is in motion. The river flows, the seasons turn. Our breath, in and out, never still. We suffer not because things change, but because we expect them not to. To be stoic is not to resist the current. It is to learn to swim within it. You cannot control the wind, but you can adjust your sail. To accept what is outside your control is not weakness. It is wisdom. You do not give up. You simply stop fighting what is not yours to fight. You turn inward. You focus on your response, on your choices, on your peace. This is the power of acceptance, and it begins in the present moment. The future is a ghost. The past is a shadow. But the present, this moment, is real, and in this moment you can choose to breathe, to act, to remain calm, to be here, right now. Part 3. Focus on what you can control. Epictetus said, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not." This is the first distinction every Stoic must learn. You cannot control the weather, but you can control your mind. You cannot control the actions of others, but you can control your response. You cannot control death, but you can control how you live. When you focus only on what you control, you gain a new kind of power: calm, clear, composed. Let us name what you can control: your thoughts, your choices, your attitude, your effort, your integrity. These are yours. The rest is not, and so we release the rest. This does not mean you do nothing. It means you act with reason and without fear. You plant the seed, but you do not demand the harvest. You do your duty, and let nature do the rest. This you become resilient, not brittle, but flexible. Like the reed that bends in the wind, you do not break, and that is strength. True strength. Part 4. Practical Stoic Strategies. Philosophy is not words, it is a way of living. Here are practical ways to build your Stoic muscles, to train your mind, to meet uncertainty with peace. Journaling and reflection. At the end of each day, ask, what did I do well? Where did I falter? What could I have done differently? This is not judgment, it is training. Seneca wrote letters to himself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal, "You can do the same." Premeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils, each morning. Imagine what could go wrong: delays, disagreements, discomforts. Not to worry, but to prepare, so that when they arrive, you are not surprised. You are ready. Negative visualization. Picture losing what you love, not to grieve, but to treasure. You will value it more. You will cling less. You will fear less. Voluntary. Discomfort sleep on the floor. Go without your favorite food. Walk in the rain. Why? To remember you can. Comfort is not a need. Courage is. 5. Mindfulness and meditation. Sit still. Breathe slowly. Watch your thoughts pass. Like clouds. You are not your thoughts. You are the sky behind them. In silence, you find strength. Part 5. Living a Stoic life. Stoicism is not a tool. It is a way of being. It is how you speak, how you eat, how you treat others, how you meet each day. In your work, be diligent. In your words, be honest. In your dealings, be just. In joy, be grateful. In pain, be patient. This is a Stoic life, not cold, not detached, but full, meaningful, free. The Stoic is not emotionless, but they are not ruled by emotion. They feel deeply and choose wisely. This brings not only personal peace, but professional excellence. The calm mind decides better. The grounded leader inspires more. The resilient person creates strength in others. Think of Admiral James Stockdale, a modern Stoic who survived years of torture in Vietnam. He credited Epictetus for his strength, or Viktor Frankl, who, in the camps of Auschwitz, found meaning even in suffering. These are not myths. They are men. Men like you, women like you, capable of greatness, through choice, through virtue, through Stoicism. Conclusion. Return to the present. Uncertainty is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It reminds you that life is a river, flowing, changing, beautiful. The Stoic walks to the river's edge, and instead of fearing the current, they step in. They move with grace, with strength, with peace, and so can you. Remember, you control your mind. You choose your actions. You create your peace. No matter what life throws your way, that is the Stoic way. And it begins now, right here. And this was your guide to meeting uncertainty with the soul of a Stoic.